Today we start a new series that we're calling Changing from the Inside Out, the only way real change happens. And here's what we're going to do, not just today, but over these next 4 weeks. And I hope that today might strengthen you, touch your heart such that you say, not going to miss, I'll be here through Father's Day, at least. What we're going to do over these 4 weeks is this. We're going to take a look at some things that can help us personally, very practical things that can help us personally when it comes to our changing in the ways that we need to change. That being our focus, we're going to turn again to what we looked at a few moments ago. We're going to turn to the 32nd chapter of Genesis, and specifically here, again, we're taking a look at the life of, a moment in the life of, a man named Jacob. Now, most of our Bibles label this section, and they label it, Jacob wrestles with God. Here's what's beautiful about that label. We all wrestle with God. You may not want to admit it because you may think that makes you a bad person, but man, we all wrestle with God. And here's why that actually is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, and God especially knows this. Here's why wrestling with God is not only okay, it's a really good thing, because oftentimes it's in the midst of our wrestling with Him. Often those are the times when He can and does change us the most, if we'll but let Him. In those times, in order to let Him, we got to pay attention to certain things. It's those certain things that we want to turn to today, these phases of change, we might call them. That's what we want to focus on today, because this incident in Jacob's life, man, it illustrates these phases so beautifully. So let's get started. And if you're following along on your inserts today, I hope you are. Again, very practical stuff. Begin to fill these in. Here's the first phase of change that we find here. A crisis, or more specifically, a crisis in Jacob's life. Now, let's be very clear about this as we begin today. I'm going to say this very strongly, and I want you to hear this. God never, ever intentionally sends a major crisis into your life. Never. No matter what you hear from other pastors, from other churches, from other denominations, from your friends, God never intentionally sends a major crisis into your life, because daily He is going to bring you joy and love, not hurt and pain. Now, having said that, the truth, though, is this. He can take any crisis you face, anything that life or others throw at you, and He can use it for great good in your journey, if we but let Him. Guys, here's something we've got to understand. When we come to faith, our greatest struggle is never ever going to be with our finances, with our physical health, with our relationships. When we come to faith, and this is after we've said, I want to follow you, Lord. When we come to faith, our biggest struggle is always going to be with God. And why is that? Because as human beings, inherently, we want to be in control. And a part of our walk with God, when it's true, is again, that surrender. We'll do it sometimes, but it's hard for us to do it always. Guys, this is the first thing we see in Jacob today, in that he really thinks that this crisis he's about to face, this crisis he is already in, this battle with his brother over their birthright. I don't know how many of you have siblings or brothers who have brothers. If there were times you kind of were thinking, I don't know why mom and dad kind of favor him more than me. I mean, this is even bigger than that. This is about, again, birthright. Who's the one who will inherit? Because at that time, it wasn't really both in many ways. One was going to rise above the other. In the midst of this battle, in the midst of this struggle, he really is thinking initially, I got to handle this on my own. So what did that mean when God came along and said, I'm here and I want to help you with this? What did that mean for him? It meant he had to temporarily stop struggling with his brothers so that he could do what? So that he could start fighting with God, wrestling with God. In Genesis 32, starting with verse 24, we find Jacob taking certain actions so that he might be alone. Again, sometimes we do that when we face a crisis. Initially, we think, I don't want to be with others. I'm struggling with this. He first isolates himself here, and it's then that the struggle with God truly begins. Here's verse 24, words from earlier. So Jacob was left alone, and a man, again, this is God, a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. Now, if you're like me, you got to love these words initially here in this passage. When the man saw that he couldn't overpower him. Guys, this is God wrestling with Jacob, not being able to overpower him, even though he wanted to. Again, what does that speak to? That speaks to how much at times when we need God most, we still push him away. When it comes to us changing for the better, God often will use a crisis initially to simply do this, to just get our attention. Initially, that's all he's trying to do with Jacob. He'll at times use these moments to just get our attention. And so with that as our first thought, simply want you to ask yourself this first today. Are you in the midst of a crisis right now that is getting your attention? And can you now begin to realize, oh gosh, this is God that is trying to work through this. This is God that in some way is trying to kind of wake me up to the fact that I'm not alone as I move through this, that he can be a help to me. First off, just ask yourself, are you facing a big crisis right now? Has it really kind of grabbed you? And can you begin to think, oh yeah, that's God grabbing me. Wonder what he wants to kind of do in terms of helping me. I wonder what he's trying to lead me into here. Using what he didn't give me, but now using it for good. When it comes to us changing, if phase one is crisis, then phase two is this, commitment. Meaning once God has our attention, now we've got to be fully committed to seeing our crisis through. And why is that? Because only then can we truly learn everything that we need to learn. Related to that, here's what we now find in Genesis 32, now verse 26. Then the man, again this is God, then the man said, let me go, for it is dawn. But Jacob panted, I won't let you go until you bless me. Now, I don't know if Jacob knew for sure that he was wrestling with God, but I do know this, that at some point he began to sense what he was up against, and that led him in the midst of his crisis to really say this, you know what, I'm going to keep this struggle alive until I gain the blessing that I need, or I'm going to keep this struggle alive until I begin to learn the things that I realize now I really need to learn. In other words, what's he saying here? He's saying this, I'm committed to seeing this through, facing it head on and seeing it through. Guys, here's another thing that God knows when it comes to us changing, that we'll always miss out on the ways we need to grow, relationally, spiritually. We will always miss out on that growth if we give up too soon. And we often do that, don't we? As a pastor, some of the most difficult calls, phone calls that I receive from time to time come from people who, in essence, call to say this to me: hey, pastor, just want to let you know, I am really struggling right now. I've got some big-time things that are coming into my life. I'm battling them hard. They're wearing me out. I'm telling you this just to also say this. That's why you're not going to see me in church for a while. Right? What? Why do I hate to hear that so much? Because I know that they're saying this. You know, in the midst of this crisis that I'm facing, especially because it's so big, tell you what, I got to get away and try to handle this on my own. In other words, that translates to this: they're not very interested in God getting their attention, or at least I know God hasn't gotten it yet. And furthermore, it doesn't seem like they're very interested in seeing their crisis through with the help of others so that they might learn what they need to learn. If you're facing a crisis right now, then far from pushing God away, and sometimes it's easy to do that. Why? Because we think He's caused it. He can use it, doesn't cause it. If you're facing a crisis right now, then far from pushing God away, cling to God. Because here's the deal. He wants to bless you now, long before your crisis ends, right? He wants to lead you to some very important lessons long before you move all the way through what you're facing. And man, that's important. If phase one is crisis, God gets our attention because of what we're facing. If phase two is commitment, we hang on to our struggle long enough so that we might learn from it. If those are phases 1 and 2, then here's phase 3. Whenever I get to smiling, and I don't know, those of you who are close enough, it's only because this stuff is great. This is the hardest phase. And I've heard this sermon before. I've heard it like 6 times, right? When the pastor goes off to talk to himself. It's just getting ready for you. If those are phases 1 and 2, then here's beautiful phase 3. Again, one of the toughest phases, because I don't think oftentimes we want to do this. Phase 3 is this: confession. And what does that mean for our purposes here? It simply means this: we're willing to stop blaming others for the crisis we face, even though they may have played a role. At this point of confession, we're willing to stop blaming others for the crisis we face, and we're willing to think more deeply about what we've done, the role that we've played in all that we're going through. Fair enough? Notice what we find in Genesis 32:27. This is beautiful. And most of us, man, we can't understand what this means unless we can go a little deeper and kind of understand what was going on in that day. So let me try to unpack this. Here's what we find in 32:27. The man, again, this is God, the man asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, "Jacob." Now you might think, what in the world can that teach us? Well, here's the deal. While that might not look like a big thing on the surface, here's what God is really doing through that question. He's getting Jacob to own up to his part in what he's going through. And here's what I mean by that. In Jacob's day, names had great meaning. They were very significant, the meaning of someone's name. Do you know what Jacob literally meant? It literally meant the ambitious deceiver. The ambitious deceiver. How would you like that hanging around your neck, right? Because others knew what that meant in that day. So when God asked Jacob, "Hey, what is your name?" He's in essence saying, if you'll just say Jacob, then you're going to begin to move toward acknowledging, confessing who you are in many ways, and thus what you have brought to this struggle. Guys, here's why this is so important for us. Not just for Jacob, but for us. Because we'll never be able to change in the ways we need to unless we're willing to humbly face our flaws. And one of the very best ways we can do that in the midst of a crisis One of the best ways we can do that is to simply be willing to say to God, God, here's what I know I'm bringing to this. I confess this. I offer this. Here's what I know I brought to this, and I don't want to do that anymore. So I confess that some of that already, before I get through all of this, might begin to change. Here's another thing God knows when it comes to us changing. He knows that confession is something that's so important because it rids us of our excuses. And our excuses are that which most often gets in the way of our growth, spiritual growth, relational growth. So ask yourself thirdly today, what excuses are you offering up right now in the midst of your crisis? And how do you need to begin to own up to, instead, what you've brought to the things that you're facing? And then there's a fourth and final phase that is usually a part of any change process: conversion. And by that today, we don't mean conversion as in we come to Christ. Instead, conversion, as we're using it here, simply means this: we're converted to a new way of seeing things, especially when that comes to how we truly view a crisis. Guys, here's the last thought I hope you'll grab onto today. When we convert to a new way of seeing things, when we begin to see things like God sees things, when we do that, that truly does lead us to an inner transformation, one that not only draws us into a new way of thinking, it draws us into a new way of being, a new identity. Here's how God responds to Jacob's confession. His confession regarding his old identity, the ambitious deceiver. Here's how God responds to him owning up to that. Genesis 32, 28 and 29 now. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. Then he blessed him there. Again, thinking about the meaning of names, notice what really happens in this final phase. Jacob gets a brand new identity. Because here's what this new name literally means. No longer ambitious deceiver. Here's what this new name literally means: the one who struggles with God and overcomes. I think it's safe to assume that when Jacob ended his struggle with God, he saw himself very differently. I think it's also therefore safe to assume that seeing himself differently, seeing things differently, man, that greatly affected how he lived his life from that point on. Meaning this wasn't just about, gosh, how can I get through this crisis? How can I get through this moment? Instead, man, this was about him growing in ways that would change his life forever. It's the same for us. So as we kick off this series, know that we're not just talking about dealing with a crisis. Instead, we too are talking about something so much bigger than that. Let me share with you on a personal level as we close today. And I hope this might be a help to some of you as you say, okay, this is kind of how Rob processed through a crisis in his past, how that kind of changed who he is now, how he looks at things now. I hope that might be helpful as you go forth in a few minutes and begin to think about how these phases apply to you. Several years ago, I faced a big crisis. I mean, it wasn't life-threatening. It wasn't one of those kinds of things. But, man, lasted for a while, unbelievably difficult. And it's probably the only time, I've been very fortunate in life, only time I've faced something like this. And in the midst of this crisis, I knew several things. You know, we get in a lot of trouble when we know things, right? Well, this is what I knew in the midst of that very deep crisis. I knew that there was nothing about this crisis I was in that could possibly be used for good by God or anyone else. Are you with me? I knew in the midst of that, I was so smart, nothing that could be used for good in the midst of this crisis. I knew that the best strategy I could turn to was kind of avoiding it at all costs, pretending like it wasn't there, just trying to keep my head down, see if it would pass. And then lastly, I also knew this, that other people certainly had created this crisis, for sure, and I had very little to do with it. You ever been there, right? I knew those things beyond a doubt. So with that knowledge in hand, I never, ever could begin to see my situation as God wanted me to see it. Long before that crisis passed, I could never start asking the right questions. Flash forward to today, because here's what I know today. And I'm not always perfect with this, but here's what I know today. Here's what I know I would do differently, because I know what God has done within me, the lessons I have learned. Here's what I know today. First, if I could go back there in the midst of that, when things began to get really, really tough, I would now ask this question: God, how are you trying to get my attention? Why are you trying to get my attention? What's going on here? I know I'm not walking alone. I know I'm not supposed to be walking alone. What's going on, God? You've got my attention now. Secondly, when things began to get really, really tough, I would have asked myself this as well. How can I commit myself to facing this head on? No more avoiding it. No more thinking that's even a possible strategy that can work for good. How can I really face this head on so that I can begin to learn in the midst of the crisis what I need to learn? Not later as I look back, but right now. And then lastly, when things began to get really, really tough, right now I would also embrace confession. And I'd specifically confess this: God, here's what I know I brought to this. I confess, here's what I brought to this because of who I am and who I've been in the midst of this. God, I don't want that. So make me a new being, a new creation. Guide me in the midst of this, in the midst of my confession, to be transformed. I know that today I could do those things because not only now is God helping me to see each crisis in a different way, now I'm a new creation in Him. I share that in closing so that maybe for some of you, or maybe for all of you in a little way, that might help you as you begin to think more deeply about how these things, these phases, really can apply to your life. Hey, what a gift this story from Jacob is. This key moment in his life. May we learn all that we can from what we've taken a look at today. Let's pray.